everyone. Welcome to Bay Area Book Festival Unbound, a virtual conversation today with Adam Hochschild, who is the author of 10 amazing books, one more riveting than the other. And also my favorite thing that he has done, one of the founders of Mother Jones magazine, where I am the CEO. I'm Monika Bauerlein. I'll be your moderator today. And we'll be talking about a very unusual marriage. Adam, as I said, has written 10 books, all of them nonfiction, many of them zeroing in on these incredibly interesting stories from history. One of them that you may know is King Leopold's Ghost. It's about Belgian colonialism in Congo. Spain in Our Hearts is an incredible story of the Spanish Civil War. And Adam's latest book is Rebel Cinderella, which is about the extraordinary relationship of Rose Pastor Stokes, who was an immigrant worker from the tenements, who married Graham Phelps Stokes, a wealthy heir, and she became a very important figure in the labor movement. It's a really wonderful love story, but also an incredible tale of class and politics and all those things, really. Class, politics, crisis, and relationships are very much on all of our minds right now. So I'm so delighted to be here with Adam. Adam has a special treat for you today. He'll share the arc of the story with words and pictures, and then we'll come back and talk a little bit about what he's told us. So Adam, the screen is all yours.
Thank you, Monika. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's always a pleasure to do something with two of my favorite institutions, the Bay Area Book Festival and Mother Jones magazine. So let me share my screen with you so that you can see the pictures that I want to use to tell this story. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about this new book with you. It's a book that is really about the life of this woman, Rose Pastor Stokes, but it's also about her very unusual marriage, which is one that I think offers a window onto life in this country a little more than a century ago. Its hopes, its ideals, and its enormous injustices. Let me trace her story first. The woman who would become Rose Pastor Stokes was born in Tsarist Russia in the town of Augustov in 1879. She was Jewish, but the Jews of Augustov, or at least some of them, did not live in a separate shtetl because Rose's father, from whom her mother separated very soon after her birth, who was a cobbler, and he lived above his shop on this central square of the town. When Rose was born, the Russian Empire was under the rule of Alexander II. He was the good guy czar, the reformer, the man who freed the serfs. And he also eased a few of the very harsh restrictions on Russia's Jews. He was by no means a human rights activist, but he was considerably less anti-Semitic than many others in the Romanov dynasty. However, the lives of Rose and her mother and millions of others were upended by something that happened 2 years after her birth, hundreds of miles away, in St. Petersburg, the Russian capital. Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. And as soon as he was dead, his successor imposed harsh new restrictions on the Jews of Russia, and there were a series of terrible pogroms over the next 25 years. Hundreds of people were killed, often Jewish homes and shops were burned, leaving their owners homeless. And this, of course, is what spurred the great exodus of hundreds of thousands and eventually millions of Jews from the Russian Empire. Among them was Rose, then 3 years old, and her divorced mother. For the first 7 years after they left Russia, they lived in London, living in great poverty in the city's East End. And it was there that Rose had the only formal schooling she ever had, less than 2 years. But it was enough for her to gain the ability to read and write in English and to develop a great love for English poetry. When she was 11 years old in 1890, she and her mother came to the United States, like millions and millions of other immigrants, on packed immigrant ships like this one. And they went immediately to Cleveland, Ohio. And there, Rose had to go to work right away in a factory making cigars. Here is the first picture of her, taken in 1896. She's third from the left in the back row. Here's a close-up. There she is in the middle in the back row, 16 years old. She did this work as a cigar worker for a dozen years. By the end of that time, she was supporting herself, her mother, and 6 younger siblings who had been abandoned by a ne'er-do-well stepfather. She worked all day. Often she worked in the evenings as well, earning about $8 a week, the equivalent to about $240 today. Not much to support a family of that size up. And rolling cigars was hard work. The oil and the tobacco leaves seeped into your clothes, your skin. It was impossible to get rid of the smell. The air in cigar factories was kept humid because you didn't want the outer wrapper leaves to get dried out. So windows were nailed shut in the summertime, and very fine tobacco dust filled the air and filled workers' lungs. Cigar workers actually had the second highest rate of tuberculosis of any occupation in the United States. Only stonecutters had it worse. Rose would have lung problems as long as she lived. When she was 21 years old, something happened that changed her life. She saw a copy of a New York Yiddish newspaper, the Yiddisches Tageblatt, or Jewish Daily News. That paper ran one page in English, and it invited contributions from readers all around the country. So she began sending the newspaper sentimental poetry, anecdotes, little stories about things in Cleveland, and before long, they gave her a column, an advice column, under the headline, "Just Between Ourselves, Girls." And one day, she received a check for $2 in the mail and was amazed to be learned that she could actually be paid for writing. She was even more amazed when, after 2 years, the newspaper invited her to New York to work full-time on its staff there at double the salary she was earning as a cigar worker. So she arrived in New York in 1903, very excited by this new opportunity, 23 years old. And imagine how that city looked to somebody who was seeing it then for the first time. Skyscrapers like none she'd ever seen before, elevated trains puffing along like this one above the streets, trolley cars pulled by cables beneath the streets like the cable cars in San Francisco today, an enormous subway network being built, though not open yet, and even on the streets a few of the extraordinary new horseless carriages. New York was a city at that time that would have terrified Donald Trump because it was a city of immigrants. More than half the men over 21 years old in Manhattan were foreign born. New York would soon be the largest city in the world. It was already the largest Jewish city on earth. This is a picture of the Lower East Side, the center of the Jewish population of New York, where Rose lived and worked. And it was peddlers like these and people who worked in the shops on these streets that she interviewed and wrote about for the newspaper. One day, however, in the summer of 1903, 6 months after she'd arrived in New York, the newspaper's editor gave her a different assignment, which was to go and interview somebody who worked at a settlement house on the Lower East Side. Now, you probably know something about settlement houses. These were places that were set up throughout the big cities of the northeastern and midwestern United States to provide services in poor neighborhoods, childhood nutrition programs, baths and showers, not just for kids, but for adults, because these kinds of things didn't exist in New York City tenements. Settlement houses also held adult education classes in English literacy and other subjects. Now, the interesting thing about settlement houses was that although they served a population that was almost entirely immigrant and poor, the volunteers who staffed them tended to be well-to-do college graduates. This is the settlement house on the Lower East Side, the university settlement, where Rose was sent to do her interview. And here's the man that she was told to interview. James Graham Phelps Stokes, called Graham by his friends. And as you can tell from the name, he was an Anglo-Saxon Protestant. He and Rose fell in love. Now, Graham Stokes came from the most different kind of background, different from Rose, imaginable. Here, for example, is a picture of his family's summer home in the Berkshire Mountains of western Massachusetts. At the time that it was built, in the 1890s, it was the largest private home in the United States, 100 rooms. Legend has it that one day Graham Stokes' brother, who was in the class of 1896 at Yale, sent a telegram to his mother saying that he was, quote, bringing some apostrophe 96 fellows, unquote, home for the weekend. The apostrophe got dropped from the telegram, and the mother replied, "Many guests already here, have only room for 50. When they were not living at this place and at another lavish summer home they had, the family lived in this mansion in New York City at Madison Avenue and 37th Street. It's part of the Morgan Library today. Here are Graham's parents. Each of them came from a large fortune, which they combined. The money came from part of the Phelps Dodge mining empire, from New York City real estate, especially luxury apartment buildings on the Upper East Side, and from a cluster of gold and silver mines in Nevada and a railroad that led to them, and more. Graham's parents had 9 children, and here are them and some of their spouses and offspring. The boys in this family were expected to play prominent roles in life, and they did. One became a famous architect, one became an editorial writer for the New York Times, one became what today would be called provost at Yale University, grandson became an Episcopal bishop. The girls were expected to marry well, as one said, and they did. One married a nobleman and became a baroness, another married into the family of a former Secretary of State. Graham Stokes, however, took a somewhat different path in life from his brothers and sisters. After graduating from college, he went to medical school at Columbia. And while working as a medical student on a horse-drawn ambulance, he was exposed to a very different New York than the one he had grown up in. He was shocked by what he saw. This was the New York of the tenements, where you often had immigrants living packed 6, 7, 8 people to a room. In tenement houses where often the only toilets were outdoor outhouses like these. And of course, New York City's tenements famously doubled as makeshift sweatshops for the garment industry. Graham was outraged by what he saw, and that was what led him to become part of the settlement house movement. He and Rose courted secretly for 2 years, and then finally news of their engagement leaked out and received immense attention. Newspapers all over the United States and Europe and Australia, everywhere reported it. This is the page 1 headline from the New York Times reporting the news of their engagement. Here it is as the lead story on the front page of the New York Evening World. And as you can see, that what attracted attention was not just that it was a marriage of someone extremely rich and someone extremely poor, but of Jew and Gentile, which was very, very unusual for those days. So it was both a class and an ethnic difference. And it's exactly what makes people still interested in such marriages today. Like, look at all the attention we pay to Prince Harry and Meghan Markle. Now, this same newspaper, the New York World, immediately signed up Rose to write a series of stories for it, calling her the genius of the ghetto. And then in the summer of 1905, over the well-concealed opposition of Graham's family, they got married on Rose's 26th birthday. Graham was 7 years older than her. The press remained fascinated by this couple, and they lived in a blaze of publicity for years. The core of the public's fascination, of course, was that here there seemed to be the Cinderella story. Prince Charming rescuing poor, virtuous Cinderella from her humble hearth and bringing her to live in his castle. And of course, everyone hoped love would conquer all the differences between them. Here's a picture of Rose very soon after they married. However, their lives did not really fit the Cinderella script, for Graham to some degree had left the castle, and Rose had no desire to live in one, although they often stayed at one of these enormous houses of his parents. It always made her uncomfortable. She and Graham were both acutely conscious that they lived in a country with enormous disparities of wealth. Some people lived the way Graham's family did. Others were desperately poor and often worked in dangerous conditions as well, like these child coal miners in West Virginia. In 1906, the year after they married, Rose and Graham joined the group that they thought had the best answer to such problems, the Socialist Party. The party's leader at that time was Eugene V. Debs, a noble, much beloved man, 5 times a candidate for president. He had begun as leader of the Railroad Workers Union, and when he was campaigning for president in 1908, he traveled around the country in a special train called the Red Special, with red flags and red bunting flying. And when locomotives passed him on the opposite track, engineers were thrilled to see the Red Special and gave long blasts on their whistles. Debs came to New York in 1908, campaigning for president, and Graham Stokes was campaigning with him because Graham was running as socialist candidate for the New York State Legislature from the Lower East Side. Rose campaigned for him. Neither Graham nor Debs won, but people still remained fascinated by this couple. Everyone still saw Graham and Rose as the Cinderella story. Their marriage inspired 2 novels, loosely based on their story. Here's one of them, and it was actually turned into a silent film. Unfortunately, the film has been lost, but we still have some of the promotional photos from it of the actors playing the roles inspired by Rose and Graham. Here's one, and we will just have to guess what they were supposed to be saying to each other in that scene. Now, despite these Cinderella fantasies, this was a time when millions of Americans, even those not living in great poverty, were becoming aware of the injustices in this country. And one episode that dramatized the terrible labor conditions of the day involved clothing workers like the ones in this photo. It was a fire at the Triangle Shirtwaist Company in New York City, just off Washington Square. A terrible fire. The workers on the upper floor here were trapped. Most of them were unable to get out. There was an inadequate fire escape, which collapsed under the weight of people on it. The door to a stairwell, which people could have escaped through, was locked to keep union organizers out. 146 people burned to death or leapt out the window to their deaths. Of the dead, almost all were women, half were teenagers, and almost all were immigrants, Jewish and Italian. 120,000 people marched in a mourning procession through New York streets. 300,000 people lined the streets to see them. As Rose continued her journalism, issues of labor and social justice were now what she was writing about. And also women's rights. She got involved in one case with echoes of some of the battles still going on today in the Me Too era. A case that drew her attention involved that of a woman named Sarah Coton. Sarah Coton worked as a nurse for a doctor in New York whose home and office were in the same building, and the doctor gave her a room to live in. One night, he piped chloroform under her door, and when she was unconscious, he raped her. Some weeks later, she realized she was pregnant. She went and got a gun, shot and killed the doctor, and surrendered to the police. As soon as she heard about this, Rose went to the prison where Sarah Coton was being held, interviewed her in Yiddish, and wrote up her story at much greater length than anyone else. She also announced to the press that she would pay Sarah Coton's legal expenses, and after she was released from prison, would give her and the baby a place to live. Coton's trial was delayed until she gave birth, and then she was found innocent, in part because another woman who had been assaulted by the same doctor came forward. Starting a few years after Rose and Graham married, around 1909, for a decade or more, the United States was convulsed by strikes, with hundreds of thousands of workers walking out every year. And this was at a time when labor unions had almost none of the rights that they later acquired. Some of these strikes were suppressed by the police. These are Chicago police here arresting a striking worker. Sometimes they were suppressed by troops. These are striking clothing workers in Massachusetts facing the state militia. One big strike was of garment workers in New York City, and Rose was heavily involved, often speaking to groups of strikers, often many times a day. It was really in this garment workers' strike, begun in 1909, that Rose came into her own as an organizer and as an immensely popular speaker. She was soon recognized as one of the great radical orators of her time. And more, it was she, rather than her husband, or rather than the two of them as a couple, who was the subject of the ongoing cascade of newspaper stories. And there are signs that Graham was not completely happy about this. The most colorful strike that Rose got involved in was of hotel and restaurant workers in New York City in 1912. Organizers walked into one restaurant or hotel dining room after another, usually just as lunch or dinner was about to be served, and the waiters blew a whistle, and the waiters walked out. Waldorf Astoria, Delmonico's, the Luncheon Club of the New York Stock Exchange, on down. Rose was on the strike committee. She addressed many rallies of striking waiters. She wrote and spoke about the miserable conditions in which many of them worked. And in her papers, there are many, many letters of thanks from these waiters. Now, one of the hotels that was struck in this strike was the Ansonia Hotel on Broadway, the Upper West Side in New York. And it had several dining rooms. It was a famous gathering place for musicians, show business people, and mobsters. And its owner was Graham Stokes' uncle, William Earl Dodge Stokes, or Uncle Will, as they called him. He was a man who was a passionate hater of labor unions, immigrants, and much more. And he was absolutely furious that his beloved nephew's wife was organizing his own waiters to go on strike. He'll come back into this story later. You'll see in a moment. Let me turn to another aspect of the lives of Rose and Graham. One of the things that made them so fascinating for me to write about was their friends. They knew and worked with the people, the most interesting people in the United States of that era. Here are some of them. Here's Rose with Eugene Debs on the left, and behind them Max Eastman, editor of The Masses, the best magazine in the country at the time, in many ways sort of a precursor of The New Yorker. Also in their circle was Big Bill Haywood, the leader of the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, the most militant labor union in the country. He was a former miner, cowboy, saloon card dealer, charismatic orator, famous for using his fists when necessary, and for being able to recite long passages of Shakespeare by heart. They knew John Reed, probably the finest journalist of his generation, Lincoln Steffens, the great muckraker, W.E.B. Du Bois, the greatest black intellectual of his time, Mother Jones, Mary Harris Jones, the woman who Mother Jones magazine is named after. Rose and Graham knew all of these people. Another friend was Upton Sinclair, to whose novel The Jungle we owe our food and drug laws. When he was writing it, he sent it chapter by chapter to Graham Stokes for his comments. Another friend was Margaret Sanger, the birth control pioneer, in the middle in this picture. Now, we take access to birth control for granted today, but this Brooklyn clinic that Sanger had set up was shut down by the police, and Sanger was sent to jail. Rose was active in the campaign for birth control when talking publicly about such things was against the law. Another friend of theirs, finally, was Emma Goldman, often in jail, the great anarchist firebrand. This is a mugshot taken at the time of one of these arrests. And all of these folks, Rose and Graham knew, they worked with, many of them were their house guests. Some of them left us their recollections of the couple. Goldman, for instance, who was always very blunt, thought Graham Stokes was a stuffed shirt and couldn't understand how Rose put up with him. Now, the period of American life when all these people were active was a remarkable time, a time when all of them believed that the world could be changed and that a new and radically more just society could be brought into being. Sadly, though, something happened that brought that period of great optimism to an end: the First World War. It was a war that not only killed millions of soldiers and civilians, it also shattered the radicals' dream that the working classes of different countries would never go to war against each other. America, however, did not join the war when it started, and American socialists and other radicals agitated strongly for the U.S. to stay out of the conflict. Rose, Emma Goldman, and many other friends joined something called the Women's Peace Party and took part in demonstrations like this one. However, finally, in the spring of 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went before Congress and asked it to declare war. American troops began going to France, soon in large numbers. By mid-1918, they were heavily involved in the most fierce fighting. Here at home, the country was swept by war fever and by ferocious propaganda from the government, like this U.S. Army enlistment poster. There was a tremendous paranoia about spies and great paranoia directed against anti-war radicals. I don't think you can read the caption at the top of this cartoon, but it says, "Now for a roundup." Many radicals still felt strongly that the war was a huge mistake, but they were harassed and arrested when they spoke out. The war, for the first time, created a political rift between Rose and Graham. She became firmly convinced that it was a terrible mistake for the United States to join the war, and she began speaking out against it. Graham was so enthusiastic about the war that he enlisted, went into uniform. He was too old to be sent overseas, but he served for several years in the New York National Guard, although he never came closer to combat than marching in parades like this one in 1918 going down Fifth Avenue. Something else that divided Rose also happened in late 1917. The second stage of the Russian Revolution, when the Bolsheviks took power. Rose was for this, Graham was against it. Rose continued speaking out against the war and now in favor of the Russian Revolution. And this drew the ire of many people, including Graham's uncle, the angry hotel owner. Remember him? Here's a report about him from the files of the Bureau of Investigation, where as you can see, this is the predecessor of the FBI, where, as you can see, he's reporting to them that they ought to make a search of Rose and Graham's house. A few days later, after sending this report, he called the Bureau. He told them that Rose and Graham were going to be out of town and that was a particularly good time to search the house. And they did. The Bureau kept a close eye on Rose. Agents followed her, stenographers took down her speeches, and finally, after one anti-war talk, she was arrested. In the summer of 1918, she was put on trial, and she was sentenced to 10 years in prison because people who spoke out against the war at that time were treated extremely harshly. Graham put up bail money, and they appealed the case, and eventually, several years later, it was overturned on appeal, so she didn't have to go to jail. But by this point, the marriage was on the rocks. They remained together for 7 more years, but very uneasily because they were going radically different directions in politics. Rose joined the Communist Party and actually in 1922 went to Russia as an American delegate to a meeting of the Communist International. And like far too many people, she thought that in Russia she had found paradise. Graham searched for paradise in a different direction, abandoned all his involvement in progressive politics, and became interested in religion, especially in blending the traditions of Hinduism and Christianity. In 1925, they got divorced very bitterly, and it put them back in newspaper headlines for the last time. As soon as they were no longer a couple, the press completely lost interest in them. But, happily for me, they saved all their letters. Rose kept a diary. They wrote dueling memoirs. So I had rich material to work from in trying to reconstruct their relationship and the ringside seat they had to a remarkable period of American history. So do historians a favor. Keep diaries, save your letters, write a memoir. Give us something to work from. After the divorce, Rose, as a matter of principle, refused to accept any alimony, and she found herself living in poverty again. She remarried, but to someone as poor as she. Soon after, she contracted cancer, and she died at the age of 53 in 1933. Graham also remarried, but to someone of his own class this time, and lived on to the age of 88, dying in 1960. So that's their story. I wish I could say that they changed the world, though perhaps through their eyes we can see a world that needed changing, as it still does today. So let me stop right there and turn things over to you, Monika, and I'd love to chat with you in any way you want about the book.
Thanks so much, Adam. I love that you can tell this story in images as well. And I'll take your advice and not throw out my incredibly embarrassing diaries for the benefit of some future time.
Oh, good.
I did find it almost eerie reading this book because it's so contemporary. You have this time of incredible inequality and huge fights over immigration and reproductive rights and white supremacy and propaganda, attacks on the press, pandemic. So I just don't know, how did you find a time that's even more Trumpian than this one?
That's a good word for it. Yeah. Well, it reminds you that all this stuff that we're dealing with today, hostility towards immigrants, white racism, which today goes under the name of white nationalism, enormous inequalities of wealth. There are dark currents of all of these things that run through American history. In some cases, they've gotten worse. When you talk about inequalities of wealth, for example, the share of national income and national wealth held by the top 1% today is greater than it was than when Rose and Graham got married in 1905. The hostility towards immigrants that we see today, just a day or two ago, Trump announced that he was shutting off all immigration to the United States. This was a theme that ran through that period of 100, 120 years ago, again, like a sort of dark river. Graham's uncle, Uncle Will, William Earl Dodge Stokes, was very active in the eugenics movement, which believed that, the best Americans were those of Anglo-Saxon stock, and everybody else was inferior and should either be kept out of the country or have their numbers drastically reduced. And this actually made him quite in favor of Rose's activities on behalf of birth control, because he wanted to make birth control information available and free to all those people whom he thought there should be less of. And of course, we're still struggling with those issues today as Planned Parenthood clinics get closed down in one state after another. You would think after 100 years we would have won some of these battles decisively, but like all good things, you have to keep fighting for them.
Yeah, I was trying to think of a story like this for the present day. And, it's sort of like Eric Trump, or maybe, Barron a few years older, falling in love with a young, asylum seeker and, turning to socialism and becoming Bernie followers. Is that about the level of shocking developments that this played as?
That is. If we could imagine, now Barron Trump is a little young to get married, but what's the unmarried daughter's name? Tiffany. I think she is not married. Now, if we could match her up with a dark-skinned asylum seeker, that would grab headlines just in the way that this story grabbed headlines 120 years ago. A match of people as opposite as you could possibly expect.
And you have, there's actually quite a racialized strain in the commentary about these two and about immigration at this time that really shines through in the book. People found ways to be incredibly and explicitly racist about the world that Rose was coming from.
Yeah, that was very much so. At that time, the big thing on the minds of people in, cities like New York and Boston and the Northeast, and we're talking, 1903 when Rose came to New York, 1905 when they got married. Remember, at that time, the great migration of Black people out of the American South had not really started. So in the big cities of the Northeast and the Midwest, there are very few Black people. But what the racial tensions there were really between the Americans whose ancestors had come in the middle or early part of the 19th century or earlier, which meant people, basically from Northwestern Europe, from England, from Germany, from places like that. And then starting around 1890, the great bulk of immigrants coming to the U.S. came from Southwestern Europe and the Russian Empire, Italians, Greeks, Jews. And there was tremendously strong feeling about this. Jews were explicitly or implicitly barred from, all sorts of clubs. There were Jewish quotas at universities that were reduced and reduced and reduced. There was a lot of anti-Semitic feeling. There was an episode that happened on the Lower East Side just before Rose got to New York, where a funeral procession for a prominent rabbi passed under the windows of a factory that made printing machinery. And workers began throwing bits of scrap metal down on the procession, injuring many people, and then went down and got into a fight with these folks. And the police came and, of course, arrested the people in the procession and not the workers who'd been beating them up. So there were a lot of episodes like this, a lot of bad feeling. And you can see when you look, one of the fun things about being able to look at letters is when you look at the letters exchanged among members of Graham's family, when they found out that he was marrying not just a woman who was Jewish, but who was Russian Jewish, which meant much poorer than the German-speaking Jews who immigrated to this country a couple of generations earlier, and many of them had gotten wealthy. So his family members are writing to each other, and at one point, Graham's brother, who had met Rose, was writing to the parents who had not yet met her, saying, well, she doesn't look too Jewish, but still a little bit about the mouth, and so on. So, the feeling came up in many ways. And of course, one of the liberating things to the people who were part of it about that early socialist movement and other brands of radicalism that were around at the time, the Henry George single taxers, the anarchists, and so on, was that, of course, those were movements that were usually explicitly anti-racist and made no distinction between Jews and Gentiles and blacks and whites.
So that gets at the countervailing strain in the book. We try to articulate this properly, but you found this, love story that bridges all these differences, and that's a real strain of how America has dealt with class and race differences in its own narratives. Is we tell ourselves that in the end, love conquers all of these things, and there's even a strain to political movements, including the ones that these two were involved in, that is very much built on that idea, and that we're all brothers and sisters and can love each other. So, did you gravitate to that story to explore the possibilities and the limits of overcoming these gaps?
Yeah, in part I did, because it's so rare that you have these kind of documents that I mentioned, the letters, the diaries, the memoirs, the accounts by people who knew them, the thousands of newspaper articles about them, that really allow you to kind of think you can reconstruct what went on inside a marriage that far in the past. And I think certainly at the beginning, both Graham and Rose and people who followed them avidly, and there were people who compiled scrapbooks of newspaper clippings about them. I saw one at the New York Historical Society, filled with these brittle yellow newspaper clippings, somebody pasting them into the pages of a scrapbook. Certainly they and their fans, so to speak, hoped love would conquer all. Well, love didn't conquer all in the end, and I think for a couple of reasons. One of them has to do with the fact that when they married, Rose, as I mentioned, was 7 years younger than Graham. She had had 2 years of formal schooling. He had multiple graduate degrees, and he knew various famous writers and artistic figures and so forth. And she was very much in awe of him. And I think really for the first 8 or 10 years they were together, she kind of looked to him for her political opinions. And that it took her about a decade or so to realize that she fully had a mind of her own and that she was smarter than he was. And that he, I think, because I think at the beginning, both of them had imagined a somewhat traditional marriage. They were socialists and everything, but still many people in radical movements, as we know all too well today, sometimes have pretty traditional ideas about the roles of men and women. And I think they did. She outgrew them. He never did. And he began to get more and more disgruntled when he saw that the public's attention was on her and not on him. And I think this was what one of the things that made him jump at the chance to join the military when the First World War began. I think joining the military is often a way in which men find direction for their lives when nothing else seems to have worked out very well.
So just to go all the way into relationship advice here, since there are a lot of people at the moment who are finding that maybe the person they married and that they are now stuck with 24/7 is not entirely the person they thought they were, and that you may be very different from your spouse or partner. Did you glean anything from what was clearly a very loving relationship for many years about that we might learn from at this moment?
Well, I think one thing, if we could retroactively give them a little couples counseling, I certainly would have counseled Graham to be more accepting of his wife's intellectual growth, and to be more accepting of the fact that, okay, she was getting more attention than he, but she deserved it. And these are hard things for anybody, 100 years ago or today, often to tolerate in a spouse. But I wish they had. It would have been nice if they'd stayed together and made it a Cinderella story that worked. There are many things I would like to have changed about their story. I would love to have seen Rose be like her friend Emma Goldman and realize that the Soviet Union was not paradise. But alas, she never quite got to that point.
This is the moment when we want the narrator to interject that Adam is married to Arlie Hochschild, who's an extraordinary writer and scholar herself. So wherever you speak, in terms of intellectual peers in a relationship. Do you think that the time that they were living in made this more difficult than it needed to be? Would it have been easier for love to conquer all if they had lived 100 years later?
Maybe, because I think there's much more awareness today, thanks to the second wave of the women's movement that began around 1969 or 1970, that the personal is political, and that the values that you espouse in politics, that you're speaking about, to large audiences or whatever, if you're saying that you value equality there, that you have to value it in the home as well. I think that sense that the personal was political was not so widely shared then. And of course, women and men, often were educated separately, and, even for, women were arrested for smoking on the street in New York in 1905, 1906, because that was supposed to be something that only men were allowed to do. So I think it was a little more difficult to create a very genuinely equal relationship in those days, especially because I think they didn't start out with that as a goal in mind.
Even as they made the cigars, they were arrested for smoking.
Yeah, if you went out to the street and started to smoke one. Yeah, that's an irony there.
I'm really fascinated by how women in this time found ways to almost jujitsu today we would call them misogynist standards of their time to gain leverage. And you mentioned Mary Harris Jones, who, as Mother Jones, became one of the most famous labor leaders in America and was a couple of decades Rose's senior, but they, as you mentioned, they met. And in Mother Jones's biography, you see how she, at a certain point, crafted the public persona of this kind of grandmotherly figure, and really made use of the authority that attached to the status of grandmother, because there were no other spaces for a woman to inhabit as a leader. How would you say did Rose have to do that? Did she invent her public persona and leverage the status of women to make a space for herself?
Not in quite the same way that Mother Jones did, because I think you're right. Mother Jones kind of fixed on that grandmother image and figured this was what she wanted to brand herself with, so to speak. Rose did pay a lot of attention to how she was portrayed in the press. All their lives together, they subscribed to a press clipping service and sent them many articles that appeared about them in the nation's press. And of course, there were many, many times more newspapers at that time than there are today, sadly. And Rose continued to subscribe after their divorce, at which point she had virtually dropped out of the press. Whenever a paper reported something that she'd said and she felt they hadn't reported it accurately, she wrote a letter to the editor. If it was a story that appeared in several papers, she wrote to several papers. She was good at cultivating journalists. She knew, for example, that journalists, you're writing a feature story, you want to overhear dialogue. So when, for example, a reporter came to interview her over lunch in a restaurant in St. Louis, she engaged the waiter in conversation and asked if he was a member of the waiters union, knowing that this was kind of the thing that the reporter would scribble down in her notebook. She allowed reporters into her home to see how she lived and to see that she cooked for herself and didn't employ a maid. But she wasn't sort of crafting a particular image in quite the same way that you described Mother Jones doing. But she was certainly aware that the press was a vitally important means of communication.
In fact, newspapers are such a character in this book. I think I counted, and there are something like 83 references just to newspapers in general, let alone individual ones. And at a time when we're witnessing, playing out in front of us, the agony and impending death of the press as we have traditionally known it. We may end up in a situation by the end of this year where many cities no longer have a daily newspaper. What can we take away from looking back at this moment when newspapers were such an incredible force in our political life?
Well, I think it already is an ongoing tragedy that we're living in the death of newspapers. And of course, the whole coronavirus crisis is going to make it worse because for newspapers and magazines as well, it's shrinking dramatically the advertising dollars that keep them alive. People are consuming more news than ever. We're all online all the time, trying to figure out what's happening and how long this thing is going to how long it's going to last. But the institutions that we depend on when it comes to the printed press, they are in dire crisis right now. Certainly, as a historian, going back 100 years ago, it's lovely to have an abundance of newspapers. There were like 8 or 9 daily newspapers in New York at this time, daily newspapers. And that's just the ones in English, because there were newspapers in all sorts of other languages as well, like the Yiddish one that Rose wrote for. You can't always say that all these things were good newspapers, because when you look at how the press covered things, the press then, as now, far too often moved in lockstep. And when you look, for example, at the controversy that Rose and Grimm were involved in between themselves, and that eventually got Rose arrested and indicted, protesting against the First World War. There were virtually no daily newspapers in the United States that took a strong stand against the First World War, did serious investigative reporting about the factors that led to American entry in the war, which were not really the noble causes that Woodrow Wilson talked about. So I think even though we have a drastically and tragically shrunken number of newspapers in the country today, the content of the best of them, like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and so on, is a lot better and more critical than it was 100 years ago. And we have a rich array of other news sources, like Mother Jones Magazine, like ProPublica, like other news nonprofits that are starting up on a state and local level around the country, that provide more of an alternative voice than was easily available back then. I mean, it's not completely true, because there was a socialist daily in New York City, which Rose and Grimm actually helped fund and which she wrote for. But I feel there is a rich menu of a variety of sources of news available today that in some ways is better than what was easily available back then.
If they can make it through the coronavirus crisis.
Exactly. Yeah.
But we'll both be putting in a plug for everyone to find news that you can support, so that we may nurture the next Rose Pastor Stokes.
That's right.
I'm wondering, Adam, we have only a few minutes left, but what really stuck with me about this book, as I said at the outset, is how much that time mirrors some of the trends that we see today, only perhaps even more starkly. And I wonder what we might, how did America get out of this, I guess is my question, so that we might imagine how 100 years hence we might be able to look at what we're dealing with now and see how we got out of it.
Well, you know, the United States went through a horrible period that Rose and Grimm lived through. And I'm thinking of the period 1917 to 1920 or 21, when some 2,000 people were sent to jail under the Espionage and Sedition Acts not for practicing espionage or sedition, but because they spoke out against American participation in World War I. It was a time of widespread vigilante violence. There was more than one lynching a week in the South of Black people. There were some white labor organizers who got lynched as well. It was a really rough period. The worst of it came to an end in 1921 or so, but the great inequalities continued. I think we didn't really have a different kind of government in the United States until Franklin Roosevelt came to power in the New Deal. It makes a huge difference who's president. Roosevelt was a person who genuinely cared about reducing those enormous disparities of wealth, genuinely cared about putting the millions of people out of work in this country back to work. Paradoxically, he himself, came from an enormously wealthy family and vacationed on U.S. Navy ships in the Caribbean and so forth. But people knew he cared. People knew his wife, Eleanor, cared too. And, she went and visited factories and coal mines and so forth. There was not a racist bone in either of their bodies. Imagine if somebody like Donald Trump had been president during the 1930s. We would have come out of that era in a very different way than we did. So go out and vote. Go out and campaign for politicians who stand for what you believe in. It matters a lot.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And I hope everybody watching this and participating in the Bay Area Book Festival sees why you absolutely must read Rebel Cinderella. Or if you have read it, you should give it to someone you love. And you should definitely find someone or look at someone who loves you the way that Rose and Graham loved each other. If you stay here, you'll quickly see a link so that you can buy Rebel Cinderella and have it shipped to you. And please check out the other programs in this amazing series from the Bay Area Book Festival. Once again, I'm Monika Bauerlein, and you have been watching Bay Area Book Festival Unbound with Adam Hochschild. Thank you, Adam.
Thank you, Monika.